In progress.
Hello, welcome to the Journey of Grief, Becoming Us Without Them. My name is Barbara Field. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I specialize in the treatment of trauma and addiction and attachment and grief. And I started this channel so that there would be a place for people who are grieving all kinds of losses, for people who are grieving, people who treat people who are grieving, and folks who work in the addiction treatment field to all have a voice and be able to find resources. And today I've invited Anthony Sparzo to talk to us about his work and how that relates to grief. So, Anthony, how about if you introduce yourself and tell us what you would like us to know?
Thank you, Barbara, for having me today. My name is Anthony Sparzo. I'm a co-founder and owner of Phoenix Rising Interventions. We do court advocacy, substance abuse treatment, mostly interventions. And when I think about grief, I think about two sides of grief. I think of the grief I experienced as an addict. And then because of my work in the field, I've gotten the opportunity to see the grief on the other side, the family of the addict. And I'll get to that after talking about it, but that would be living grief. It's it's as complex as the grief that an addict can suffer. I think in regards to being the addict and being addiction, active addiction, even after we have gotten sober, we continue to suffer from many of the stages of grief, which are denial, anger, bargaining, and depression and acceptance. Apologies. All of those things are kind of cyclical. We don't go through the stages in order. I don't think it'll ever happen that way. And just when we think we've gotten through a stage, we'll go right back to denying, the existence of that loss that we have suffered. Now, as an addict, I know that for years, I took my addiction, which I suffered many losses when I was a child, and I suppressed it. I suppressed it with alcohol and drugs, and it worked very well for me for many years. When I would come out of it, typically, I would have to face that reality when I went to jail. Then there was the shame and the guilt of being where I was at, letting down the people that love me the most, my actions, all of this combined for a storm of grief that I experienced on a daily basis. So any chance that I had, to use to suppress it again so that I didn't have to feel everything that was overwhelming and the loss of confidence that my family felt, never thinking of what they were really going through. And I was able to, it was successful for a long time. I think about the addict today that I work with. I've been sober for 18 years now. And in that 18 years, I have still dealt with those five stages of grief in regards to myself and those that I've lost along the way during my sobriety. And it is very difficult. And, we wonder why there is so much relapse, specifically around the holidays, because that is our trigger. And we get triggered during these holiday events because that's when it comes up. That's when, their birthdays, anniversaries, any of those significant dates that we shared with that person we love will cause a trigger. Now, we either have a strong support network that we can go to, or we can go back to the only support we ever knew, which was drugs and alcohol. And in that case, the relapse does occur. When we have the strong support system, we can go to those people. We can go to the therapist. We can go to our groups, and we can share that with others that are suffering from the same thing. When we talk about acceptance, and like me and you talked earlier, is that acceptance, and the whole model of DAPTA was first coined by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross back in the late 60s, and it was for people to come to resolution and acceptance of their own mortality, that they were in the process of passing. And of course, that got expanded, to include those that are in living grief, those that are in active addiction, and the grief that they're experiencing. And there is a lot of similarities between the two. I think the difference that over the course, even over the last few days of really looking at the subject, and something that I'm personally going through at the time, is what we experience and the support we get as an addict, as opposed to the family of the addict that doesn't see a lot of support and is filled with a lot of hopelessness, just like an addict is. But there is a lot less social support for the families that are watching their loved one, they're mourning, basically, their passing. The fear that engulfs the parents, the wife, the husband, the brothers, the sisters, the grandparents, that their loved one is forever gone. There's no timeline to it, there's no resolution to it. And what we are seeing is we're in a perpetual state of anger, to denial, to deep-seated fear. We get very depressed. The fear is something that I think for parents and loved ones of an addict is cyclical. It just continues to, it comes up in your dreams. It comes up when you're at work. It comes up when you're watching television at home. It takes over. There's the depression, there's the anger of the way that they've treated us. There's the deep fear that I'm never going to see them again. That to parents that I've actually worked with that are actually almost resolved to say, I know I'm going to lose them. And,
Mhm.
preparing themselves for that phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning says, we have bad news. How we are able to get through that, I don't know that I have that answer. I don't know that anybody has that answer. We talk about going through the stages, and we talk about, what a timeline like that looks like. And me and you again talked about that earlier. And that timeline, which is still used widely as advice that's given to people in therapy, is that, if you do it the right way, which I don't think there is a right way, there's a safe way, there's an active way to do it. But is it the right way? It depends on the person. I've seen people that 15 years later, they're still struggling with that loss. I think the wisest thing I've ever heard is that we don't get over it. We learn to understand it and somewhat accept that this person is not coming back, and we learn to live a different way. I think my father said it to me to where I could understand it the best, is after my mother passed away. He said, there's something about you that will never be the same when you lose your parent. I can only imagine what it's like for someone that loses their child, which is the deepest grief any human being can experience. I've seen that, and the leading experts have all agreed that losing a child is the greatest grief that any one person can experience. We're not supposed to outlive our children. And with that said, my father just said there, you would never be the same. And, a year after he was saying that to me and my mom, he passed away. And he was right.
Mm.
I'm never going to be the same. There isn't any denial. I had time to, understand that it was coming. There was no bargaining. None of those stages really, maybe anger that my parents didn't get a chance to live longer. But other than that, I have accepted that I'm going to feel a sense of loss and a sense of pain for the rest of my life. They were my mom and dad, you know. I've watched different people with different family members. A really, really close friend of mine lost her grandson 2 years ago. She's not only grieving, and it's at its most extreme, what she's grieving for her grandson who was 4 years old, but she's also grieving for her son who he lost his son. And so she's grieving two people at the same time, one that is gone and one that is here. So she's experiencing the grief of loss and then also that living grieving of watching her son, who is now emotionally and psychologically completely unavailable to her anymore. And I think that's the best way to describe living grief is that we're dealing with somebody that is still alive and but is not available to us anymore in the role that they occupied in our lives. And that is it's a terrible, very hopeless feeling to experience that. We're unable to cope with the fact that this person is right here, but actually not. And a lot of people go through it with family members that have Alzheimer's. And as I talked about earlier about my brother has Alzheimer's early onset, and he is a year younger than me. And he'll remember me, my voice, but 5 minutes later, he'll ask, "Who is this?" So there's a process of grief that comes and goes within minutes. Like when we start to talk and we start to reminisce about old memories because it's a short-term memory that's being attacked. The long term, he can still remember certain things. So you forget, you get involved in that moment and you try to celebrate that life that we had. But at the same time, 5 minutes later, you're reminded and you immediately drop into a place of grief. And that I think is the trickiest thing about grief is that it comes and goes rapidly quick. I can be walking about my day and then it hits me. Something will remind me of either one of them. And I'll realize that I'm on borrowed time with them, much the same way a family member is with somebody that, a loved one that is addicted or has mental health. And, we coin it to be emotionally hostage. And, I don't think that an addict is out there to hold anybody emotionally hostage. And sometimes I wonder if we should even be saying that, to a family member. And I could be wrong. I think that I have some skills and understanding. I've been in the field for 15 years. I've done many, many interventions, and I'm always there to supply hope and love and support to both sides to bring them, reunification. And it is a very painful process, when we're talking specifically about addiction. As an
Well,
addict,
there's we can separate intent from effect. So nobody, when they were 5 years old, was sitting around with their buddies saying, "Oh, I can't wait to grow up and be an addict and destroy people's lives. It's going to be so fun." So nobody intends to grow up and be mentally ill or be as wounded as my parents or be addicted. But the rest of us and they are dealing with the effect. So we can deeply grieve the effect and also acknowledge that it's unlikely that that's their master plan for life is to hurt us.
agreed, absolutely agreed. And I think that's what we try to convey um, to the families, that they're hurting, they're confused, that there's a mental health piece that came a long way before, the addiction. The addiction was just a way to suppress it. It could have been the loss, of a family member at a young age. Even before we even understood what death was, we were grieving as children because our system, our family system changed, and we're grieving the loss of that life that we once had, even if we don't understand that mom or dad or brother or sister is no longer coming back. And we're not really sure where they went. We just know that our life has been altered. And once we become old enough to finally understand it, right around 12, 13 years old, is when addiction starts to take place, and that, for most addicts, is the 2 year window between 12 and 14 years old when we start to break away from the family system, for which a lot of times that's where the trauma began, you know? And
So can you elaborate a little bit on, so there's so much lost in the addiction. We lose ourselves and so much. But then once we get into recovery and maintain sobriety, now we have to fix all that stuff that motivated the addiction in the first place. But it's only a matter of time before addicts look back and say, oh crap, would you look at that? So, what are the kinds of things that people awaken and grieve in ongoing sobriety?
well, there's a lot. I mean, we gotta grieve the loss of the marriage. We have to grieve the loss of the career. We have to grieve the loss of our children that we lost during our active addiction. A lot of people grieve the loss of all their finances, their business, anything that they held value, especially when the marriage, is ruined or, the children get taken away during the process of addiction. Now, all those things continue to be real. So they're continuing to grieve, which many times that's exactly why relapse is so high. It's usually something from the past that we did or we experienced during our addiction that can lead to the relapse. Again, that's why finding recovery, will help us deal with the grieving, come to better understand it. There we can accept it. And then we move into a different phase, which is to repair, amend, um, you know, to our loved ones, find a new career, get our children back, and try to fix what we lost. Now, there's certain things we're just never going to get back, and we have to really recognize that and be at peace with it. We can only make amends so much, and it's the same thing with families when we go into recovery. They're hyper vigilant, this is finally what they wanted, but they're so afraid, still grieving, the process that they just went through. It might have been, a decade, it might have been 3 or 4 years, but they're still in the process of grieving and not trusting, that this new person is going to continue to be that person that, and they're still grieving that this person is never going to be the person that they were meant to be. Whatever they, did or didn't do during their addiction, their trajectory that mom and dad had always set out for them, that's not going to happen now. Whether it's because they picked up criminal charges, they've outaged themselves out of the career, they're no longer going to go to school, they're, all the dreams that the parents had are gone. So even as the loved one gets sober, finds recovery, they can find solace in that, but they're still grieving the loss of the dream that they had for that person. And that's a tough one. Again, we are forever changed. I think
Mhm.
I don't think that we come out of grief and, in some way that we haven't changed permanently, you know.
So
Um,
a lot of people talk about, even though they've wrecked so much stuff and what they should have been, a lot of people discover at the end of this journey an amazing version of themselves who's changing the world and say, well, this is what I was intended to be. It was just a rocky road to get here. And so people tend to, we have these expectations. People should park the way we want them to park. They should drive the way we want them to drive. Our children should build our dreams the way we want them to be built. And for whatever reason, when people don't live up to our expectations, it's something we can work on our resentment list in our Codependence Anonymous meeting. But another aspect is the family dynamic. So back when AA started healing people, they discovered family systems theory, where the family's sort of like a mobile. And
yes.
and the whole family is attached to the addict. And when the addict gets well, the family system crumbles and it has to restructure itself. And sometimes the family system pulls the addict back into the addiction, so the mobile is balanced again. So talk about your work with families and how you help families reshape themselves when their dreams come true, but the
Yeah,
addict steps back in and says, ew, you people are codependent.
right. I think that what we really try to do is, one, a lot of times we we work with the one that's in recovery, not to go home. We really emphasize independence because we do see fractures in the home system, and so something like sober living and keeping them kind of independent from the family. We work with the families, helping the families to establish boundaries, also identifying where there is issues within the family unit that could cause you know um, added damage or could lead to relapse upon return home, because there's many families, the system is just not healthy, so I mean, it's trying to point out to the family members that a lot of this behavior and, without pointing blame on them, is to help them kind of understand that this is where he or she is at. This is where you guys are at. Let's fix, let's help you get well while they're getting well over here in their new life. And then trying to bring the reunification, and put everybody back together, but everybody's got to consciously be working on it. If they're not working on themselves, and that includes mom and dad, brother, sister, because there's going to be a lot of resentment within that household, so resentment's not going to do anything for the person that's trying to heal. It most certainly will lead them back to, an angry relapse. F it, since nobody wants me, nobody believes me anyhow, because they have to, and they also have to realize that the family is scarred. So it's just a lot of balanced healing that has to happen on both sides. And if there is, too many fractures in the home, then it's always good for the one in recovery to stay separated from it and have their own boundaries for re-engaging with their family members, so that they remain safe, the family remains safe, and everybody comes to understand and love and respect each other in a new way, a healthier way. So,
So when you work with a family, what are the resources you offer them? Like, you all should be going to Al-Anon or Codependence Anonymous, or you all should be in therapy, or you all should be doing some stuff. So what are the resources that you offer not only to the addict, there's a lot of that
right.
is out there, but what are some effective ways that families restructure themselves as individuals and as a family unit so the addict gets to be not the thing that everybody stares at and worries about?
Right. Well, that's good. That's a great question. And with our interventions, we do a family systems intervention. We stick with the family well after placement is done. So we start working with the families almost immediately, um, telling them, it's about putting them first now. They have seen, what they wanted accomplished has now been accomplished. So now it's time to take an inner look at yourself and what you need. That happens through weekly therapy. My partner, my wife, she's a trauma therapist. She's pretty amazing. And we really get them to look at each other, look at their marriage, look at the structure of their home, look at all the needs and wants that they put on hold for years in order to deal with the loved one that was suffering. That a lot of finances go into taking care of the loved one. A lot of their time, vacations are put on hold. So, what are some of the things that you want to do? And really trying to get them let them recover, in a much different way. but let them mentally and psychologically recover. And we help them to try to guide them to their own recovery. And again, like in a much different way, but what are your unrealized dreams? What would you like to do now that you're not on constant, hypervigilance over your loved one? And so we, really try to guide them to, you know, what has been missing from your life and what would you like to do with your life now? And answer
That's
the
great.
question, setting up boundaries, yeah, and really supporting them and letting them know how important their feelings are, how important their needs are, that their needs are met, and really start to stabilize, like when it's mom and dad, stabilize the marriage, because that conflict has divided the parents, as a husband and wife. It most certainly happens almost all the time. You know, they remain connected, but there is a fracture in the marriage. I have seen it, 75% of the time in marriages because there's always one parent typically that is more of the enabler to the loved one's behavior, you know,
Typically,
one that
yep,
one
that's
that is
true.
really hard and one that is really hard and one's like, dads with daughters, and mothers with sons. And it's just observation. It doesn't mean that I'm, right on the money, but I'd say that most people, that are in this field, interventionists that, are really observant, would recognize that there's some truth in that. So
Yeah. So, at the end of my videos, I always ask you to tell us your 1 minute wisdom. So, if nobody listened to anything we talked about this whole time, but you can send them out of here with one thought to help them understand the process of grief and addiction and recovery from addiction, what's the one thing you want people to know about addiction and grief?
I would honestly say that it does not matter which side you're on, whether you're the one that is struggling with addiction, whether you're now in recovery from addiction, whether you're the loved one of somebody that you've watched go through addiction, that healing is absolutely possible. Recovering on all fronts is possible. Loving each other again is possible and necessary. Forgiving each other is absolutely necessary and possible. Coming together is necessary and possible. All of it is something that can happen. You can take your lives back. You can build new dreams. You can walk through it together at some point, and you all can heal. You absolutely 100% can heal. It's not possible. It's a guarantee if you allow it to happen. There's steps to go through, but I've seen families ravaged by drugs, alcohol, and I've seen wonderful results, you know, of them coming back together and really having an amazing life together, and that's the beautiful
Oh,
thing about human spirit. We can recover, and many of us do. So
that's great. So, thank you so, so much for giving us your time and sharing your wisdom. I really am honored that you chose to participate. And I'm going to stop the recording now. And thank you very much.
thank you